Okay, let's get to our guest tonight. Our guest tonight is a gentleman by the name of Michael A. Hoffman. He is the author of a recent history book entitled They Were White and They Were Slaves. It's the untold story of the enslavement of white people in early America. Mr. Hoffman was educated at Oswego State Teachers College and Hobart College. He is a former reporter for the Albany and Buffalo, New York bureaus of the Associated Press and a former director of the Institute for Historical Review. He is the author of 3 other books, by the way, and has published also a bi-monthly history newsletter entitled Revisionist Researcher. And Mr. Hoffman, are you with us tonight?
Yes, I am.
Appreciate you being with us tonight. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Good. Well, you've done magnificent work on a book that, as I don't have to tell you, is not politically correct.
That's right. It isn't at all.
How's it being received out there?
Well, it's being received as sort of a samizdat publication. People are ordering it through bookstores, and there's a growing audience for it. We've sold several thousand copies, and I think that the more publicity that it gets, eventually the audience will grow nationwide and worldwide, God willing.
Well, let's start talking about it. I got some questions to ask you. Now, we've been told that black people have been enslaved and oppressed in America for 400 years, and that the American people need to make reparations to blacks. Perhaps sometimes it's suggested cash payments. And as a result, they're saying of this black enslavement, that's the least we can do. Now, you've written a book claiming that it was the white people who were actually the first slaves in America. So who owes who, Mr. Hoffman?
Well, white people don't owe anyone, Pastor Peters. The fact of the matter is that white youth today are taught that black slaves and Mexicans and Chinese built this country, while the vast majority of the whites lorded it over them with a whiplash in one hand, and a mint julep in the other. But the documentary record tells a very different story. Up to 1/2 of all the arrivals in the American colonies were white slaves, and they were America's first slaves. These whites were slaves for life, long before blacks ever were. And this white slavery was even hereditary. White children were born to white slaves, and they were also enslaved. Whites were auctioned on a block with children sold and separated from their parents. Wives were sold and separated from their husbands. Meanwhile, you had free black property owners walking the streets of northern and southern American cities, while white slaves were being worked to death in the sugar mills of Barbados and Jamaica in the West Indies and in the tobacco plantations of Virginia. So the establishment has created this misnomer of indentured servitude to explain away and minimize the fact of white slavery. But if you really read even the establishment historians, if you read their footnotes, even they have to concede, at the very least in the 17th century, that black slavery was almost non-existent and that whites were the overwhelming majority of slaves in America in the 17th century.
Where does the word slave itself come from? Isn't it exclusively in reference to the experience of black people in bondage?
No, it isn't, Pastor Peters. Actually, the word slave derives from the white nation of people known as the Slavs, or the Slavic people. And they were enslaved longer than the entire history of the United States. The Slavic people were slaves about twice as long as blacks were slaves in North America. So the actual definition of that word pertains to the experience of white people in bondage, yet the politically correct historians tell us that we're not allowed to refer to whites as slaves. So it's really a huckster's game that's at work there.
It's that old wordsmith game, isn't it?
That's correct.
How did the enslavement of whites in America begin, anyway?
Well, the enslavement of whites in America really actually has its roots in Great Britain, because it's really a very complex story. Of course, the history of whites in bondage goes all the way back to the ancient world. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, of course, held slaves, and the majority of those slaves were whites. This has pretty much been the essential experience of all people throughout time, and it's ludicrous to say that it's exclusively the experience of blacks. However, if we bring this up to the American colonial period, we must go to Britain because, of course, America was a colony of Britain. And Britain began its decline in the 16th century, shortly after the reign of Henry VIII. I would say it went into decline under his son, the very weak boy king, Edward VI. And in the era of Edward VI, we see that usury, or the charging of interest on loans, that had been illegal in Britain. And during the reign of Edward VI, he was being manipulated by his counselors, and that's when usury was legalized in Britain in 1548. And from that point onward, you also had the beginnings of the enclosure laws, which was the taking away of the right of the English people to farm freely in these common lands which had existed. They were basically swindled out of their land. And from that, you had a pauperization process beginning. You had the first real beginnings of a class of white people in Great Britain known as paupers. And once you had that, of course, you had all the social evils that came along with the paupers. Now, pauperization began in a large-scale way under Queen Elizabeth I, and this is when you had the first welfare laws in Britain being passed. And when white people who had formerly been yeomen, who had been freemen, now there had been a class of white slaves in early Britain known as the villains, from which we get the disparaging term of villain. It was spelled a little bit differently with an E on the end instead of an A. However, you still had a majority of the whites able to farm and able to live as free men. Now, more and more, the majority of whites were changing over from free men and yeomen and landholders and farmers over to this class, this formal class of paupers. And that's what began the roots of white slavery, because once you had paupers, you had developing the workhouse system, which was the way to manage the paupers, which was to enslave them in an institution where they could be controlled, which was the workhouse system in Great Britain.
That's an amazing story. In fact, it's so amazing that I know there are some people, just using the understanding cognitive dissonance, that they're rejecting some of the things you're saying because it seems so fantastic that they've never heard this. What happened to whites in Great Britain if they opposed the king or they were defeated in battle? You know, in high school today and in colleges, we're told that the whites have been so-called indentured servants. That we do hear about some indentured servants in America, but never slaves. And I know you address it in the book, and I want you to tell the people about it.
Right. Well, first of all, of course, you had battle captives and people who were opposing the king, or if they lost in battle in the various civil wars and rebellions in Great Britain. Generally, one of their punishments, if they were fortunate enough to escape execution, was enslavement. And what would happen to them is they would be transported. Now, that was in a technical term. It didn't just mean that you were put on a ship, but it was actually a term related to forced deportation from Great Britain. And these various white rebels against the crown were then transported to the British Crown colonies of the West Indies, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, where they were basically worked to death in the sugar mills there. And when white tourists go to Jamaica and Barbados, they're basically going to the scene of a white Holocaust, because most of these white men didn't survive beyond the first couple of years there. However, this enslavement was long-term. It just did not involve only political prisoners or those who had lost battles, but it also involved the kidnapping, as I will discuss later, of whites off the streets of Great Britain, so that even in the early parts of the 20th century, you had a remnant of poor whites in Barbados known as the Redshanks, who were the survivors of white slavery there. So it was a very onerous thing to be captured in battle, and you were, in fact, subject to slavery as a result.
The Redshanks, would that in any way tie up with the word rednecks?
Absolutely, yes.
Is that right?
Yes, this is one of the racist terms which the media freely uses. We're often told that the most horrible word, I think this specter was summoned in the O.J. Simpson circus, that the most horrible word in the English language, one of his lawyers said, was the N-word. However, to conscious white people, one of the most horrible words is the word redneck. And this term of derision is bandied about in movies and television and in the newspapers totally blithely. We're just supposed to take this. We're supposed to be labeled in this way. However, if we look at the etymology of the word, the root of it is a means of poking fun at poor white people whose skin would redden in the sun in the West Indies, and they would be called hillbillies, Scotland Johnnies, by blacks and by wealthy whites who enslaved them, Redshanks, and eventually this term of derision, this loathsome, contemptible term for poor white people, eventually evolved into the modern-day term of redneck, yes.
That's fascinating. How were the slaves actually enslaved? How were the whites enslaved if they were not just indentured servants?
Well, the indentured servant thing was basically a racket. I mean, there was a minority of people who were in bondage who were fortunate enough to have been indentured servants, because after all, indentured servitude, when it is practiced correctly and legally, is a form of apprenticeship. Someone, as we were told in high school and college, would trade a period of his labor in return for passage over on a boat or in return for instruction in a skilled trade. So that is a legitimate a contract there between a laborer and an employer, and I certainly sanction it, and I think it's a good thing. In fact, I'd like to see apprenticeship practiced more today as more and more young people get away from the public school systems and they're homeschooled by their parents, and then as they reach their teens, why it would be quite natural for them to apprentice themselves to a manager or someone who had something to teach them. However, under this euphemism of indentured servitude, Pastor Peters, a tremendous hoax and a tremendous swindle was perpetrated against the poor white people. And that is to say, it functioned in two ways. One, as a cover-up for the actual experience of white people in slavery. In other words, as this slavery grew larger and larger, and the white aristocracy in Britain scrambled for a way to cover it up, they grouped it under the notion of a contract for indenture. Secondly, it functioned as a way of entrapping people. In other words, people would be press-ganged or kidnapped aboard ships, and a spurious indenture would be written out for them, allegedly corresponding to the biblical injunction that no servitude is to go beyond a period of 7 years, and this is where we get the notion of a 7-year limit. In fact, that limit was completely ignored, and these people were referred to as indentured servants. They were even told that they had a contract of indenture, but in fact they were slaves for life. Now, the way this occurred, the real engine of this enslavement in Britain was kidnapping. And again, if we go to our study of words, we find out that the origin of the word kidnapping, which is now a universal term for anyone who steals people, relates to white slavery. If you go to the old dictionaries, you'll find out that the original word was kidnapping, N-A-B-B-I-N-G, and it's a specific reference to stealing white children and white adults for servitude in colonial America. And tens of thousands of them were kidnapped from the port cities of England and Scotland. In fact, it got so bad in the late 17th century that parents were in great fear to let their children go to the port cities on an errand without their parents or some other adult guardian safeguarding them. And in fact, even if an adult was along, oftentimes that adult would be knocked on the head and put on board the ship. And in my book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, I give many accounts of this mass kidnapping in action. So that was the principal means by which whites were brought to America as slaves. A secondary means was to trick them into the idea that they were going to have a limited contract of indenture for 7 years. But then when they came to America, you see, there was a way to lengthen that 7 years and to violate the biblical injunction against servitude going beyond 7 years. The way that happened was to create a roster of petty offenses. For example, if a white slave was away from his work or away from the plantation for more than a day, or even for more than an hour, if the overseer decided that this was an arbitrary absence, they would add on a month of servitude to the white slave's time of service. And through various stratagems and tricks, this adding on went to the point where the people ended up being enslaved for life. And that's the real reality of bondage of whites in America. It's white slavery and not largely indentured servitude.
It's an amazing story, and ladies and gentlemen, this amazing story is told in Mr. Hoffman's book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. Truth of the matter is, whites were the first slaves in America, not blacks. And that the media is not telling you. We're carrying this book, and of course I'm offering it on this shortwave broadcast. And if you would like to have this book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, it's available for a
$16 offering postpaid.
Write to Scriptures for America, P.O. Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535. That's Scriptures for America, P.O. Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535. Mr. Hoffman, are you a Christian?
Yes, I am.
Let's go back to the book. Were there white children who were made slaves? How about white women also?
Yes, very definitely. If you were born to a white woman, then you also became the property of the owner. Now, for a white woman was basically banned. A white slave woman could not be married, and of course the slave masters realized that these women were going to exercise this function of nature, that it would be unnatural for them to suppress their procreative urge. And there were secret marriages, of course, by the score between white slave males and white slave females, but this played right into the hands of their owners, because then more time was added on to their allegedly limited service by the fact that she had these children out of wedlock. Then the children became the property of the master. Now, it depended on which era of colonial law this occurred in. The law became more liberal in the 18th century. In the early 18th century, a child born to a white woman who was enslaved would be the slave of the master if it was a female till she was 18, if it was a male until he was 21. However, in the 17th century, when things were much rougher, their enslavement could go as long as until the age of 31. So this was really dependent on the local situation in the various states. It dates back to an old Roman slave code which decreed partus sequitur ventrum. The condition of the child follows the condition of the mother. So you see, this was really a slave law, which we've seen all these heart-rendering Hollywood movies and on Ted Turner's TNT channel and so forth. But what they never tell us is this was first the experience of white people in bondage, and only later the experience of some black people in bondage. So yes, white families suffered tremendously under white slavery in colonial America, you bet.
You're not saying that there weren't black families later on that also suffered, are you?
No, of course not. I regard the enslavement of blacks as a terrible tragedy for black people, but a worse tragedy for whites, primarily because this country, the Civil War, I think, was partly fought because there were white men in the North who abhorred the idea of using Negro labor to build the country. Congressman David Wilmot was a great Northern congressman who sponsored the Wilmot Proviso, and that said that white men should be the ones who settle the West, because the issue of the South being kind of the white nationalists on the side of the white people, and the Northerners all being race mixers on the side of the blacks, is really not an accurate dichotomy there. It was far more complex than that, and one of the issues was whether or not the Southern holders of black slaves were going to be allowed to import thousands of blacks into California and Oregon. And a lot of white working men didn't want this to happen, including Congressman David Wilmot. And so basically their attitude towards black enslavement was that it was a curse on America because white men wanted to be separatists. They wanted a separate nation, an all-white nation, and they wanted to do the toil. Now, in fact, they had done the toil because the founding toil of this nation, the great land clearing and swamp clearing, the felling of the trees, was largely done by white pioneers. So that work had been done, but as the financial oligarchy in the South continued to depend on black enslavement, this really troubled the white yeomanry of the United States. So it was a tragedy for both, but I think especially a tragedy for white people. And of course, the most far-sighted of American statesmen founded in 1830 the American Colonization Society for the deportation of blacks back to Africa, and many black people supported this, and in fact, as you know, Pastor Peters, many blacks continue to support that to this day.
Yes, in fact, I had a black speaker at one of my past Christian family Bible camps, Mr. Brock. I don't know if you've heard of him or not.
Yes, I have.
And he's certainly an advocate of it.
Right.
So what you're saying then, Michael, is that virtually every component of what we've come to know as black slavery was first experienced by whites when they were enslaved here in America.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. From the fugitive slave law, where whites had a price on their head and were hunted and nearly whipped to death, and in some cases the whippings were actually fatal, to the auctioning of white slaves. As soon as they came off ships, they were taken like cattle, and their arms were felt and their teeth were examined and so forth. And this has been tremendously suppressed. And people can say, well, you know, if this actually happened, why haven't I heard about it? Well, for those of us who are a little bit sophisticated about history, we know that history is rigged and that many historians owe their jobs to how well they play with the party line. But there's also another aspect at work here, and that is the fact that in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, because this bondage extends right up into the 20th century, white people were very ashamed if they had a background of servitude. Many of those whites ended up settling in Appalachia. They became very alienated from the mainstream of the United States, and they were ashamed of their background. There was no one to come along and champion their cause here. They saw it as a kind of a stigma. Secondly, the aristocracy that had perpetrated this Holocaust against their own kin realized that they committed a great crime, both in the eyes of sacred scripture and in the eyes of common law. And so it was in their interest to cover this up as much as possible. So it's mostly fallen to me to be the one to dig this back up again and bring it to the attention of all people, black and white, so that we can deal with it and so that other researchers and historians can further explore it, because it's a pioneering field and there's a lot of room here for further discussion and investigation.
Where did you start going to find this material? Of course, you've got an excellent bibliography in the back, so I shouldn't ask you that, but why don't you tell the people?
Well, I live here in upstate New York, and believe it or not, New York is not entirely comprised of Manhattan. In fact, we have tried to break off the state. We've tried to make Manhattan the 51st state and make upstate New York, which is largely rural and farms, its own republic. So I'm in a very rural area, and the history here is very rich. Revolutionary War battles were fought, especially the Indian Wars of the American Revolution, with Generals Clinton and Sullivan fighting the Iroquois. And also, I'm quite near to New England. In fact, when I originally became interested in this story, it was by researching Matthew Lyon, who is one of the American Revolutionary War heroes. He was a hero of the Battle of Bennington, Vermont. The famous commander of that, of course, was Ethan Allen. But as I began to dig into Matthew Lyon's story, I discovered that Matthew Lyon was a white slave. He became a very great American politician and a congressman, and in fact, he was imprisoned in a famous sedition case after the Americans won their freedom. He was imprisoned by the Federalists, but he became a great and accomplished man. He wrote a book, and he referred to himself as "by the bulls that redeemed me." Apparently, Matthew Lyon had been sold in return for a couple of deer, a couple of male deer. And, I mean, that was the status of white people in the 18th century in America. And so I couldn't find his grave, and later on I found out that he wasn't buried in New England at all, but he went down much later in his career after his wife died to the Kentucky-Tennessee area, where he made a name for himself in business. I did locate the grave of his wife, but as I discovered this, I was quite shocked that here was a great Revolutionary War hero whose life as a young man, he was an immigrant from Ireland, was worth no more than two male stags. And from there I began digging into diaries and documents and early colonial laws and piecing this together. And I also found that historians in their published works have parts of the story, but they're basically too pusillanimous to refer to it for what it is. There's a real problem among historians. They refuse to refer to whites as slaves. It's almost a phobia on their part. You can trace a great deal of their research leading inevitably, pointing in the direction of the fact that whites were slaves, but for reasons of political correctness, they can't bring themselves to use that word. So the footsteps and the tracks of this great mystery can be ferreted out in a number of areas, both in terms of original research, diaries, and letters, as well as in published histories.
During the Civil War, let me ask you this, or the war between the states as they call it, the northern abolitionists accused the southern whites of being heartless. But the Confederates, they would counter by claiming that the northern whites held white people in virtual slavery in the factories in the north. What can you tell my audience about the enslavement of white factory workers in America, and in Britain for that matter?
Yes, well, Pastor Peters, that's another suppressed story. It was one of the really great challenges of the Southerners against the North and has gone largely unanswered. The factory system, once again, began in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, and it itself was a form of enslavement. Now, we might feel to say, well, the popular image of slavery is on a plantation, and we may be willing to grant the idea that whites were enslaved on tobacco plantations, but how can you say whites were enslaved in a factory? Well, it's very easy because the documentary record shows that they were locked into the factory. The doors were locked. These were largely, by the way, children who were workers in the factories that did the very toughest of the work, both in the northern United States as well as in industrial Britain. They worked under the absolutely most horrendous conditions.
What age of children are we talking about?
We're talking from an age, depending on the machinery and the type of work, we're talking from as young as 5 years old on up to 14 or 15. So you had that situation where these northern abolitionists, many of them were factory owners. As we know, Frederick Engels was a factory owner, but he claimed to have a tremendous interest in the welfare of poor whites. This seems to be a functional act of hypocrisy on the part of the socialists. William Morris, the arts and crafts socialist in Great Britain, was a strong proponent of this egalitarian society and wanted to use a central government in order to inflict this socialism. Yet if you look at his actual personal life, you discover that he made a fortune off white child labor in the Devon Consols copper mine in Great Britain. So this hypocrisy certainly functioned among the northern abolitionists in the great mill towns such as Lowell, Massachusetts. The white people were severely injured in the machinery. Girls, I have cases where girls would get their hair caught in the machinery, and they would be scalped from the tops of their nose to the back of their heads. As soon as these white children experienced this kind of disability, they were let go. They were fired on the spot. There was no disability insurance or payments or anything like that, and they were left to die of their wounds. So there were no Harriet Beecher Stowe's that had any concern about these white children in the North who were dying in that very horrendous way.
You give an account in your book of a scene in the British Parliament during the time when the British were abolishing black slavery throughout their empire. You contrast the concern of the Parliament with the freeing of black slaves while they heartlessly had cruelty inflicted on the white slaves in England. And can you tell my audience about this?
Yes, that is an incredible story, Pastor Peters. What you had happening was, here was the House of Lords meeting in a very, they were very proud of themselves. They had a tremendous sense of their self-righteousness. They were now going to be freeing the black slaves around their colonies, and this was a badge of their tremendous benevolence. Actually, what it was is a way of assuaging their guilt for what they were doing, the millions and billions that they had made off of the destruction of the white working classes and the poor classes. And the actual scene is this. Picture the Houses of Parliament, these gilded rooms, and these very wealthy men convening over the welfare and soliciting for the welfare of these black people who were no kin to them. Meanwhile, climbing up the chimney of this House of Parliament were 6- and 7-year-old boys who were going up there, who were enslaved to chimney sweeps, who were catching cancer from the cinders that were in the chimneys. 6- and 7-year-old boys worked to death in these chimneys. Often the chimneys, not necessarily in the Houses of Parliament, but other chimneys throughout Georgia and Hanover in England, would collapse on these children. Sometimes they were forced up into a chimney that still had a fire in it, because there would be a big banquet going on, and there'd be a chimney fire, and they would extinguish the chimney fire, but the chimney was still hot, and they wanted to get on with the meal, and they would force the child or beat the child to go up the chimney. Now, many times reformers would, such as Jacob Hanwell, raised reform bills in Parliament to abolish chimney sweeping among children under the age of 10. And, Pastor Peters, they could not get that bill passed in Parliament because people like David Ricardo said that it would be an affront to the rights of property.
This is Pastor Peters, and I hope you enjoyed the interview that I had in years gone by with Mr. Hoffman, author of the book, They Were White and They Were Slaves. If you want that book, we want to send it to you, but you can't get it for free. And you didn't get this broadcast for free. You may think you did, but we had to pay for it. So remember that, as we do not solicit funds from you, but from time to time we make known to you that the Scriptures for America Worldwide Broadcasting Network needs your support. Check us out at sfawbn.com, and there you'll see the schedule for our network. If you'd like to order that book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, you ought to do it while you can still get it, while they haven't outlawed it just yet. You write to us at Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535. That's Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535. Go to our website, scripturesforamerica.org to learn about this ministry that broadcasts on the SFAWBN network. Go to sfawbn.com website to find out what all is going on in the SFAWBN network.